Hello everybody, welcome to More Chainsaws Needed, where, because I love horror, thrillers and suspense, I am going to talk, rant, rave about, review and recommend movies, TV series and books in those genres for you guys as I draw. So we're still analysing the 5-man band that were the original Universal monsters, and we're back to an original beast. Well, sort of. Because while the stories of shifters and men turning into wolves are, well, as old as humanity, since we have even a legend where Zeus turned a king into a wolf because said king had killed his own son to test Zeus' omniscience. Moral of that story, by the way, do not tease gods if your name is Lycion. That is just waiting for trouble. But even if we have those old legends, and even some short stories, and even a full novel named The Door of the Unreal in 1919, The Werewolf of London was a completely original story created for the film. But more important than that, he is not the werewolf that you think about when we talk about the Universal Werewolf. So let's meet Wilfred London, the very first Werewolf of London, and see why he was not the one who captured everyone's hearts. By 1935, Universals knew pretty well that monsters sold, so they were ready for the new one to burst on stage. But just like with The Invisible Man, they had some hiccups before our hairy hero came up on the screen. Before we talk about that, however, let's go a bit on the origins of the forest of the classic monsters, who has gone through quite a few transformations both before and after hitting the silver screen. As I said before, one of the earliest, if not the earliest, story about a man turning into a wolf can be traced back to ancient Greece, because everything can be traced back to ancient Greece, and the legend of King Lycion. However, I really wouldn't call Lycion a werewolf, because while he does turn unwillingly into a wolf, he can't turn back to human. Not only that, but there's a lot of myth in ancient Greece about men and women being turned into a lot of different animals, and plants, and things. I mean, we have the Metamorphosis by Ovidius, just to pick and choose, and I am starting to wonder about the kings of that society. But it was always one way and as a punishment, which is not exactly what happens with all werewolves' myths. By the Middle Ages, we get the first transformation of the myth, at least the first one on record, because on romances, the werewolf was usually a victim of evil magic and ready to help the hero to save their loved ones in exchange of a cure. But on legends that relied more on theology, well, the werewolf was satanic and craved human flesh. And of course, there have been a lot, and I mean a lot, different theories and retellings of the story of Little Red Riding Hood, where the wolf is replaced by a werewolf because, well, he talks and his predatory ways with Red are not exactly for food. That all of this is also a horrible campaign against poor little wolves, it's a completely different subject for a completely different video. Anyway, there are many stories of men turning into wolves in the European lore, and we're not touching the legends in our continent because we also have a ton of shifter myths from Native Americans from Canada to Argentina. But they are quite different from the European ones, so it's very unlikely they were part of the inspiration for the cinematic original werewolf. Which brings us to the plot of the original Werewolf of London movie. Wilfred London is an English botanist with a very funny name that went to Tibet in the search of a very rare plant known as the Marifasa lupina lumina, which only blooms under the moonlight and has a name that can only mean that it's a dangerous plant, but that's a different story. While he managed to get one such plant, he was also bitten by a creature that looked like a furry human. Back in London, he meets a botanist named Dr. Yogami, who insists that they met in Tibet, even if Wilfred doesn't remember him, and was also looking for the Maripasa. More importantly, Yogami tells London that the plant is a temporary antidote for lycanthropy, which is why it's imperative that London shares the blooms with Yogami, since Yogami knows that there are too many in London who are werewolves and will become feral creatures without the flowers as sap. And of course, Dr. Yogami is the one who beat London because this is not obvious at all. I mean, it would be more obvious if instead of Yogami he was named I Am the Wolf, but that's a different story. Obviously, Glendon doesn't believe a word Yogami says, until suddenly his own hand grows 4 under the artificial moonlight he created to help the Marifasa bloom. When Yogami arrives to ask for 2 blooms for the flower, Glendon refuses, but Yogami warns him that a werewolf will kill whatever they love best, and, more importantly, that if they don't kill at least a person every night, they won't be able to return to human form. And that night, when his wife and her old childhood friend leave for a party, Glendon suffers a terrifying transformation into a werewolf. Like every other Universal Classic Monsters movie, the production for Werewolf of London was not without issues. The first one was that originally the titular werewolf, Wilfred Glendon, was going to be portrayed by none other than Boris Karloff, while Bela Lugosi, who much later would be the werewolf who beats Lon Chaney Jr. in the far more popular and well-known The Wolfman from 1941, would be Dr. Yugami. Unfortunately, Karloff was filming The Bride of Frankenstein at the same time, and thus it was impossible for him to become a wolfman for the screen, so we lost the chance to see Karloff as a werewolf. Now that was a missed opportunity. Lugosi had no scheduling conflicts, but for some reason Universal decided to recast both roles, so we had Henry Hall in the titular role, while Warner Oland took the role of Dr. Yogami. Ironically, despite the scheduling conflicts with Bride of Frankenstein being cited as the reason why Karloff wouldn't be Wilfred Glendon, his wife, Lisa Glendon, was portrayed by Valerie Hobson, who was also Baroness Frankenstein in Bride of Frankenstein. So, yes, that either tells us how long the makeup sessions were, or how little the women had to do in these movies. You decide. Another change was that very early in the production, they decided to change the makeup for the werewolf, which was very minimalist in the new version, so you could perfectly see that it was still Henry Hall under it. The thing is that the original makeup was a lot more complicated and was closer to what we would see years later in The Wolfman with Lon Chaney Jr. This was changed because the first design, made by horror makeup legend Jack Pierce, was rejected by Hull, who was also a makeup artist, and insisted that since the script clearly stated that other characters recognized Glendon as the titular werewolf, then it made no sense if his face was obscured completely. Which was a good point. While Pierce was quite disappointed, the director sided with Hall instead of, changing the script so that no one would know that it was Glendon, which, in my opinion, would have been a lot easier. Anyway, while the production was not as incidental as, say, The Invisible Man, the reception was unfortunately lukewarm. It was almost a bomb. Most critics insisted that it was too similar to Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, premiered in 1931, but not considered one of the classic Universal monsters for some reason, and unfortunately, they were right. But not by any fault of the cast and crew, but because deep down, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde touches exactly the same themes of the human dark side and the animal instinct deep down inside every one of us, so of course there would be some similarities if you only stay in the surface. This disappointment at the box office might have been why in 1941 Universal did a new werewolf movie, this time directed by George Wagner and with the far more memorable Lon Chaney Jr. in the titular role. One of the reasons why a lot of critics think that the Wolfman is more memorable is because Larry Talbot, this Wolfman, is a normal common guy who is far more relatable than genius, botanist, playboy, well, not playboy, not really, genius botanist Wilfred Glendon. And of course, by making the main character not a scientist, it was a lot easier to insist that nope, this was not a furry version of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. The werewolf is not Mr. Hyde for Sona. However, while the story is a bit more tragic in The Wolfman, I think history has been a bit unfair by half forgetting The Werewolf of London. Half forgetting because there are people who remembered and homaged the movie much later. But I'm getting ahead of myself. I can't continue without admitting that there are a few commonalities between Werewolf of London and Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, since both stories are about a scientist who turns into a more bestial, murderous version of himself. However, that's about where the actual similarities end. Not just between the two movies, but also between the werewolf as a myth and the good doctor and his attempts to control human nature. Because that is the most important difference between the two things, and it's the one that most people forget. Jekyll's intent was to destroy all his evil side, or at least to separate it so he could do and enjoy all the horrible things Hyde does without any consequences to himself. On the other hand, the werewolf is almost always a victim of someone else's actions that frees their baser instincts, even as they, the human side, tries to control them. Future werewolf movies will discuss if the bestial side is really evil or not, but right now it's clearly coded as evil. More anti-wolf propaganda, if you ask me. Anyway, intent is the most important difference between a classic werewolf and our good old Mad Dr. Jekyll. That alone changes the narrative completely, because we should not feel bad for a man who was trying to play God, while we can absolutely feel bad for a man who loses control by no fault of his own except, well, not knowing that he is going to turn into a wolf under the moonlight. Or, to be more clear, not believing the story that he will turn into a wolf under the moonlight. Aside from intention, the effects of the situation are also different. Once again, Hyde was all of Jekyll's baser instincts without absolutely no control, and he attacked anyone who crossed his paths, and would only go back to Jekyll once the potion's effects were off, or he got tired of it once the potion was not needed. On the other hand, both the Werewolf of London and the later Wolfman had to kill a person a night or they would not be able to turn back into humans, which meant that they had no real choice. Either they stayed a murderous beast that sooner or later would kill someone, or they killed someone and had another day to try and find a cure. That is not exactly a choice. Not only that, for some reason the werewolf is driven to kill that person that they love the most, which means their victims were mostly personal. That is, while Hyde could just kill a guy who tripped him on the street, the werewolf would look for someone he loved, or at least someone who looked like the person they loved. And this is another interesting thing. Glendon does try to keep himself caged during his transformation to avoid hurting people, once he realizes that yes, he is going to turn into a wolf. Even if he knows that that will doom him forever to be a beast. He has a temporary cure somewhat at his disposal. The flower's bloom do keep the transformation controlled, but he has limited blooms. So he accepts that he will be transforming, hoping that he will not kill anyone, even if that means that he will never become human again. Which is of course what makes our werewolf a monster who is a tragic hero, just like Frankenstein. Wilfred Glendon, our first cinematic werewolf for Universal, has not been completely forgotten. Sure, his real star was completely stolen by Larry Talbot Jr., who was the werewolf who had the sequels, the team-ups, and the later comedy films, but that doesn't mean that the Werewolf of London didn't have a legacy, including what is considered the most seminal werewolf movie of them all, An American Werewolf in London. Just for that, it's really worth a watch if you can find a copy. I want to thank my dear patrons Mitch Hyman, Elaine Ho, Jessie, Kelly Riley, and Warrior Philip Leto, as well as my first supporter Tanya Pineda and the most amazing Amy Sung, without whom none of my videos would be possible. I also want to remind you that if you want to support these and my other projects and get your name mentioned here, you can do so at patreon.com/Adalisa, written link on description on my Linktree, as I know my name can be hard to spell. And with $1 a month, you will always be thanked in my videos, as well as get access to a ton of art before anyone else. And get the chance to suggest future subjects for videos too. You can also support me through Ko-fi, and for each coffee you will get mentioned here in 3 future videos. If you can't support me this way, I also accept likes, subscriptions to the channel, and of course, you sharing the links. I also welcome all your questions, feedbacks, and suggestions in the comments below. This was Adalisa Zarate, and remember, there's not a problem in the horror genre that can't be solved with more chainsaws and a cup of good coffee.